She's 22, and she is on her knees in 3 inches of cold water, working a rusted iron bar under the lip of a door that hasn't opened in 40 years. Her name is Wren Calloway. She has $11 in her jacket pocket, a duffel bag with 2 changes of clothes, and a key that doesn't fit the lock it was supposed to open. Above her, the old mill's stone foundation groans, water sheeting off the broken wheel outside. And somewhere behind this door, sealed with iron bolts gone the color of rust and dried blood, is the reason a stranger she never met decided she was worth remembering. The bar slips. Her palms are raw. She braces her boot against the wall and pulls again, and this time something inside the door shifts. Not open, not yet, but enough that a thread of stale, mineral-smelling air slides out into the dark, and enough that her heart does something painful and hopeful at the same time. She doesn't know yet what's behind it, but she knows, the way you know a storm is close before the sky changes, that it's going to matter. If you've ever stood in front of something locked, something you weren't sure you had any right to open, you already understand the feeling sitting in her chest right now. Stay with me for this one. I think you'll want to see how she got here, and what's waiting on the other side of that door. 6 weeks earlier, Wren Calloway owned exactly $412, a duffel bag, and nothing else in the world with her name on it. She'd aged out of the foster system at 18, bounced through 2 more placements after that, because the state still had to put her somewhere, and then, at 20, she'd aged out of that too, out of every system built to catch her, until there was simply no more catching left to do. The other kids at Pine Ridge Group Home used to call her State Kid, half mocking, half just naming what she was. A file number, a placement, a girl nobody had signed up to keep. She never corrected them. There wasn't a better word for it. She worked diner shifts, a warehouse job that let her go after her hours got cut, a room above a laundromat that smelled like bleach and other people's forgotten shirts. She was careful with money, the way people are careful when they've learned, early and hard, that nothing is coming to save them. You save yourself, dollar by dollar, or you don't get saved. The letter came on a Tuesday. Cheap paper, county seal in the corner, the kind of official letter that makes your stomach drop before you've read a word of it. It was addressed to Wren Calloway, care of an address she'd left 2 years ago, forwarded twice before it found her. Notice of unclaimed property and delinquent tax parcel, estate of Harold Ambrose Whitfield. She read the name 3 times. She had never heard it in her life. The county clerk on the phone was patient but brisk. Harold Whitfield, she explained, had been Wren's late mother's great-uncle, a name so far back on a family tree Wren barely knew existed that it might as well have belonged to a stranger. He'd died 11 months ago with no children, no spouse, and, until a records search turned up Wren, no living relative anyone could find. He'd left her a piece of property on Miller's Creek, 40 minutes outside of town, an old grain mill, tax delinquent for 6 years, structurally condemned by the county's own assessment. "Ma'am," the clerk said, "I have to be honest with you. The back taxes owed on that parcel come to $8 and change. Nobody's paid them because nobody wants the property enough to bother." $8. Wren had sat on the edge of her bed above the laundromat, holding a letter that said she owned a building, and laughed, a short, disbelieving sound, because $8 was less than she'd spent on breakfast that morning, and it still felt like more than she had a right to. She drove out there 3 days later in a car she'd bought for $600 and prayed over every winter since. The road to Miller's Creek narrowed the further she went, pavement giving way to gravel, gravel giving way to a rutted track half swallowed by sumac and wild grape. And then, around a bend where the creek widened and slowed, she saw it. The mill sat crooked against the water, 3 stories of grey fieldstone and silvered timber, one corner of the roof, caved in like a held breath, finally let go. The wheel, enormous, twice her height, hung half off its axle, black with rot, still turning a few inches with the current, in a slow, tired arc, as if it hadn't quite given up, even after everyone else had. Windows gone, a door hanging by one hinge. Kudzu had taken the whole east wall and was working on the second. She sat in the car for a long time before she got out. It was late October, and the cold coming off the water had teeth. She could smell wet stone and rotting leaves, and, underneath that, something mineral and old that she couldn't place. A smell like a cellar that had been sealed a very long time. A crow called once from the tree line and didn't call again. Everything about the place said leave. She almost did. She stood at the edge of the porch, her hand on the doorframe, and thought about turning around, driving back to the room above the laundromat, forgetting the whole $8 joke of an inheritance. But there was nowhere else that had her name on it, not 1 square foot of the whole world, and a condemned mill with her name on the deed was still, technically, more than she'd had the day before. So she went in. The ground floor was worse than the outside promised. The mill mechanism itself rusted solid, grain dust gone to a kind of hardened silt across everything, a family of barn swallows nesting in the rafters that scattered when she came through the door. But halfway across the floor, half buried under a fallen beam, she found a name burned into a support post. H.A.W. 1961, Harold's initials. And beside them, half covered by grime, what looked like a second, smaller set of initials she couldn't quite make out. Someone else's mark, older, deeper, like it had been carved by a different hand entirely. She didn't know yet that it would matter. She just noted it, the way you note a name at a party you assume you'll never think of again, and kept moving. It was in the lower level, the old wheelhouse, half below ground, where the creek ran directly beneath the building to turn the great wheel, that she found the door, iron bolted, set into the stone foundation itself, in a part of the mill that didn't appear on any floor plan the county had on file. It looked less like a door to a room and more like a door to a vault. There was no lock she recognized. No keyhole that matched the strange iron key the county clerk had mailed her, along with the deed, a key nobody could explain, found in Harold Whitfield's effects, with a paper tag that said only, in shaking handwriting, 4W. 4W. She'd assumed meant Whitfield. She was starting to wonder if it meant something else. She thought about the second set of initials burned into the post upstairs. She thought about the smell of old sealed air that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere in this building. She thought about a great-uncle she'd never met, leaving her $8 worth of condemned property, and one very specific, very deliberate key. Whatever Harold Whitfield had wanted her to find, he hadn't wanted it easy. And kneeling there in the cold water with her palms raw and that door groaning open another half-inch under her hands, Wren understood, for the first time since the letter arrived, that this might not be an inheritance at all. It might be a message, and whatever it was made of, it was still, after all these years, refusing to stay quiet. The morning after she forced the door open 8 inches and then lost her nerve, Wren went looking for a locksmith and found a town instead. Miller's Creek didn't have a proper name on any map she could find. Just a general store with a hand-painted sign, a diner with 4 booths, and a hardware store that looked like it had been stocking the same inventory since the Ford administration. She parked in front of the hardware store because it was the only one with a light on. The bell over the door was answered by a man somewhere north of 60, built like a fence post, wiping grease off his hands with a rag that had given up being clean years ago. He looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. "You're the Whitfield girl, not a question." Word traveled fast in a town this size, and Wren was starting to understand that everyone within 20 miles had an opinion about the mill before she'd even said her name. "Wren," she said. "Wren Calloway. Hollis Dunmore." He didn't offer his hand, just kept working the rag between his fingers. You planning on doing something with that place, or just picking through it for scrap before you sell the land? The question landed like a slap, though his voice hadn't been unkind exactly. Just flat, tired. The voice of a man who'd watched outsiders come and go with the mill for years, and expected nothing different from her. Wren felt the old, familiar instinct rise in her chest. Don't explain yourself to people who've already decided. She'd learned that lesson in a dozen group homes and foster placements, learned it so young she couldn't remember learning it at all. I don't know yet, she said, which was the truest thing she could offer. Hollis grunted, which might have been approval, or might have been nothing at all, and sold her a crowbar, a headlamp, and a box of shim stock without further comment. It was only when she was halfway out the door that he said, almost to the wall, rather than to her, Harold used to buy his nails here. 40 years? Maybe more? She stopped. You knew him? Everybody knew Harold. Didn't mean anybody knew him. Hollis went back to his rag. Man kept to himself. Kept that mill running long after it made any kind of sense to. Folks used to say he was waiting on something. Waiting on something. The words followed her out to the car and sat in the passenger seat the whole drive back to the mill. One more small thread pulled loose in a building already full of them. The mill in daylight was easier to look at and harder to trust. She spent the morning clearing the ground floor, hauling out 2 generations of nesting material, sweeping grain dust into drifts, propping the sagging east wall with a support beam Hollis had, wordlessly, thrown into the bed of her car along with her purchases. The work was slow and her hands blistered inside an hour, but there was something steadying in it, in doing a task with a beginning and an end, after months of days that had felt like neither. Around noon, a woman appeared on the bank across the creek, close enough to call out, but far enough that she clearly hadn't decided yet whether she was staying. Late 50s, flannel jacket, a dog at her heel that looked half again as old as it should still be walking. You're not supposed to be in there, the woman called. County condemned it. County also sent me the deed, Wren called back, immediately regretting how sharp it came out. The woman was quiet a moment, studying her the way you'd study weather that might turn. Then, to Wren's surprise, she laughed, short, not unkind. Well, suppose that's true. She crossed the plank bridge downstream without being invited, the old dog trailing behind her. Della Voss, I've got the farm up the hill. Knew Harold 60-some years, on and off. Wren wiped her hands on her jeans, aware suddenly of how she must look. Filthy, red-eyed from dust, standing in the wreck of a building everyone in town seemed to have an opinion about. Wren, I know who you are, honey. Whole town's known since the notice went up at the courthouse. Della's eyes moved past her into the dim ground floor, lingering a beat too long on the support post with Harold's initials burned into it, and, Wren noticed, on the second, older set of initials beside it. Something crossed Della's face, quick and gone. You found the wheelhouse yet? The question was too specific to be casual. Wren felt her pulse pick up. Why do you ask? No reason. Della's voice had gone carefully light, the way a person's voice goes light when there's a reason and they've decided it isn't theirs to tell. Just, that man kept a lot of himself under this roof. Wouldn't surprise me if some of it's still here. She whistled for the dog, already turning to go. You need anything? Farm's up the hill, doors never locked. She left before Wren could ask anything else. About the wheelhouse, about the second set of initials, about the particular flicker in her face at the mention of the sealed lower level. It was. Wren was beginning to understand. The shape of this whole town. Everyone seemed to know a piece of something, and no one seemed willing to hand her the whole picture at once. By late afternoon, the light had gone amber and low across the water, and the mill wheel turned its slow half-circle in the current, groaning on its ruined axle like something talking in its sleep. Wren sat on the porch steps with a granola bar from her bag, her last one, and looked at the building she now, on paper, owned outright. It didn't feel like ownership yet. It felt like she'd been handed one piece of a puzzle nobody would show her the box for. She thought about the key with its paper tag, for W. She thought about Hollis saying Harold had spent 40 years waiting on something. She thought about Della's face when she'd asked about the wheelhouse, the careful way she'd changed the subject rather than lied outright. Somebody in this town knew what was behind that iron door. Several somebodies, maybe. And every one of them seemed to be waiting to see if she'd earned the right to find out on her own. The cold came down hard once the sun dropped behind the ridge, and Wren pulled her jacket tighter, watching lamplight come on in a farmhouse window up the hill. Della's, probably, small and yellow and steady against the dark. It was the first light she'd seen from the mill in either direction, the only sign that another living person existed anywhere near this place Harold Whitfield had chosen, out of everyone, to leave to her. She didn't have a key that fit the wheelhouse door, not the way she needed one to. But she had a crowbar, a headlamp with 3/4 of a charge left, and a whole night ahead of her with nothing else to do but wonder. She went back inside before she'd fully decided to. The headlamp beam caught dust motes swirling in the wheelhouse air, and Wren stood in front of the iron door for a long moment before she touched it again. In daylight, or what passed for daylight this far below the mill's ground floor, the door looked older than she'd let herself notice the night before. Not a door someone had installed to keep out trespassers. A door someone had built to keep something in, or safe, or both. The iron bolts were hand-forged, uneven in a way that spoke of a blacksmith rather than a hardware catalogue, and the wood behind the iron, where she could see it, wasn't the same grey timber as the rest of the mill. It was darker, older, as if this door had been here before Harold Whitfield ever owned the place. She wedged the crowbar into the gap she'd made 2 nights running and threw her weight against it, and this time, with a groan that seemed to come up through the floor into her boots, it gave, not open, but enough. Enough to see, in the narrow gap, the edge of something metal catching her headlamp's light. A corner, a hinge, the suggestion of a chest or a cabinet pushed back into the dark of a room she still couldn't fully enter. Her hands were shaking, and not entirely from the cold. She didn't get further than that before the crowbar slipped and caught her knuckles hard enough to draw blood, and she sat back on the wet stone floor, breathing, staring at 4 inches of open door and the metal glint behind it, and thought, this is real. Whatever this is, it's real, and it's close, and I am not ready to be the person who opens it alone in the dark, with no one knowing where I am. It was, she'd later think, the first genuinely adult decision she'd made since the letter arrived. She backed out, climbed the wheelhouse stairs, and drove up the hill to the one lit window she knew. Della Voss opened the door before Wren had finished knocking, like she'd been half expecting it. The old dog thumped its tail twice from a rug by the wood stove and didn't get up. "You look like you've been wrestling a building," Della said, and stepped back to let her in. "I found something. Behind the door. I don't know what it is." Wren held up her bleeding knuckles like evidence. "I didn't want to be the only one who knew I was down there." Something shifted in Della's face. Not surprise, Wren noticed. Recognition. Della poured her a cup of coffee she hadn't asked for and sat down across the kitchen table like she'd been waiting a long time for this exact conversation to happen. "Harold used to say that room was older than the mill itself," Della said. "Said his own grandfather built the wheelhouse around it, not the other way round." "I never believed him. Man told a lot of stories." "What kind of stories?" Della was quiet, turning her own mug in her hands. "The kind where you can't tell which parts are true till long after he's gone." She glanced up. "There was a woman. Before my time. Before my mother's time even. Local families still talk about her, though nobody agrees on her name. Some kind of relation to the mill, way back. The kind of relation nobody wrote down properly, because nobody thought a woman like that was worth writing down. Wren thought of the second set of initials burned into the support post, older and deeper than Harold's. She didn't say anything about it. Some instinct told her to hold that card close a while longer. "You think that's who built the door?" "I think," Della said carefully, "that Harold Whitfield spent his whole life protecting something he didn't feel was his to open. And I think he waited a long time to find somebody he trusted enough to hand it to." She looked at Wren over the rim of her mug, steady and unhurried. $8 in back taxes, honey. A man doesn't leave a building worth that little to a stranger unless the building was never really the point. It was the closest anyone had come yet to saying, out loud, what Wren had started to suspect on her own. She sat with it a long moment, coffee going cold in her hands, the wood stove ticking in the quiet. "Why me?" she finally asked. "He never met me. I never heard his name until 3 weeks ago." Della's answer surprised her. Maybe that's exactly why. She didn't explain further, and Wren didn't push. There was a shape to how people talked in this town, circling a thing several times before they'd let themselves land on it, and she was starting to learn its rhythm the way you learn a language by living inside it. She stayed the night on Della's couch rather than drive back down to the mill in the dark, and in the grey hour before sunrise, unable to sleep, she found herself standing at the window, looking down the hill at the mill's black shape against the creek, the wheels' faint groaning carrying up through the cold, still air. Hollis found her back at the mill by mid-morning, unannounced, carrying a toolbox she hadn't asked him to bring. "Della called me," he said, by way of explanation, setting the box down on the porch steps. "Said you found something down there. You two talk often. Small town." He said it like it explained everything, which, Wren was realizing, it mostly did. He looked past her toward the wheelhouse stairs, something unreadable crossing his weathered face. "I'll tell you the same thing I'd tell anybody, fool enough to go poking at a 40-year-old lock alone. You don't force a door like that. You persuade it." He hefted the toolbox, brought a proper set of picks and a breaker bar that won't put your teeth through your knuckles next time. "You've done this before." "Once." He didn't elaborate, and something in the set of his jaw told her not to ask yet. "Harold asked me to look at that door. Oh, must be 20 years back now. Wanted to know if it could be opened without tearing the wall down around it. I told him it could. He thanked me and never brought it up again." Hollis picked up the toolbox and started for the wheelhouse stairs without waiting for her. Man had his reasons for everything, rarely told you what they were. Wren followed him down into the cold and the dark, headlamp beam bouncing off wet stone, and thought about a door 20 years patient, a woman with no recorded name, a great-uncle who'd waited his whole life to hand something to a stranger he'd never once met, and felt, for the first time since she'd read that county letter, something that wasn't quite fear anymore. It was closer to reverence. Hollis knelt at the door, running his fingers along the hinge line with the unhurried care of a man reading Braille. "Give me an hour," he said. "Maybe 2. She sat down on the cold stone steps to wait, watching the narrow gap where metal caught the light, and understood that whatever was on the other side had been waiting far longer than an hour, far longer than 20 years. Long enough, maybe, that patience itself had become part of what it meant. Hollis worked the lock for the better part of 2 hours, murmuring to himself in the particular language of men who talk to machinery instead of people. And when the door finally gave, not with a bang, but a long, tired sigh of settling wood and metal, nobody said anything for a full 10 seconds. Then he stepped back, wiped his hands on his jeans, and said simply, "There you go," as if he hadn't just opened something that had been sealed since before either of them was born. The room beyond was smaller than Wren expected, maybe 8 feet by 10, carved partly into the bedrock the mill itself was built on, dry despite the creek running so close overhead. Her headlamp swept across old shelving, a workbench gone grey with dust, tools she didn't recognize hung on pegs in careful rows. and against the far wall, half covered by a canvas tarp gone stiff with age, a chest, iron-strapped, the size of a steamer trunk, with a domed lid and a lock plate stamped with a maker's mark she couldn't read from the doorway. She didn't move for a long moment. Neither did Hollis. "That the something you found?" he finally asked, quiet. "That's the something." He held up both hands, stepping back toward the stairs. "Not my business what's in there. That's a family matter, and I've overstepped Harold's privacy enough for one lifetime helping you get this far." He paused at the bottom step. "But if you want a second set of hands lifting it, or a third set of eyes when you open it, you know where to find me." He left her alone with it, which she understood, even through the thudding in her chest, as its own kind of respect. The tarp came away in brittle pieces. The chest's lock, unlike the door, wasn't sealed at all, just latched, as if whoever had put it here last had trusted the room around it to do the guarding. Her hands shook, lifting the lid. Inside, bundles of cash, older bills banded in brittle paper sleeves gone soft with age, more money than Wren had ever seen outside a bank counter, enough, at a glance, to matter, though she couldn't yet make herself count it. Beneath the cash, a stack of documents in a waxed folder, deeds, what looked like old mining claim papers, a marriage certificate with a name she didn't recognize, and on top of all of it, set apart deliberately, like it had been placed there last and meant to be found first, a small leather journal, its cover worn soft as cloth, tied shut with a strip of faded ribbon. She sat back on her heels in the cold, dry room, the cash and papers forgotten for a moment, and looked at that journal like it might explain everything else in the chest better than the money ever could. She untied the ribbon with fingers that had gone clumsy and cold. The handwriting inside was careful, old-fashioned, slightly uneven in the way of a man writing by lamplight rather than daylight. The first page had no greeting. It simply began, "If you're reading this, then I was right to wait, and wrong to think I'd ever be brave enough to say any of it to your face." Wren's throat tightened. She kept reading. "I never met you. I know that. By the time your mother's people scattered the way families do, I was already an old man keeping a mill running mostly out of stubbornness. But I knew who you were, in the way a person knows the shape of a debt they intend to pay someday. I knew there was a girl out there with my blood in her and none of my luck, and I promised myself, long before I had any right to make the promise, that if I ever found her, I'd give her something worth more than money. Though I understand money is what gets your attention first, and I don't begrudge you that. Money got mine too, once, before I learned better." She had to stop and breathe before she could keep going. "This mill was never really mine to keep either. It was given to me the same way I'm giving it to you now, by somebody who believed a person could start with nothing and build something that lasts, if they were only given a place to stand. I didn't understand that gift when I was young. Took me the better part of my life to understand it. I'm hoping it doesn't take you as long, because from what little I've learned of your circumstances, you don't have as much time to waste as I did. The money in this chest is yours, and I hope it helps. But it isn't the inheritance. The inheritance is the mill and the creek, and whatever you decide to build with both of them. Everything else is just enough to get you started." The entry ended there, mid-thought, almost, like Harold had set the pen down and meant to come back to it and never had. But at the very bottom of the page, in different ink, added later, in a hand gone shakier with age, was a single line that stopped her cold. "Ask Della about the woman in the second set of initials. She'll know when you're ready to hear it. I never was." Wren sat very still in the cold stone room, the journal open on her knees, cash and old deeds forgotten beside her, and felt the shape of the whole story shift under her. Not finished, not even close to finished, but suddenly much larger than a condemned building, and $8 in back taxes. Harold Whitfield had known about the initials. had known Della knew something he'd spent his whole life too afraid to ask about directly, had left the answer to a question just out of reach, on purpose, for a woman he'd never met to go find on his behalf. She thought of Della's face in the kitchen, the careful way she'd said some kind of relation to the mill, way back, and the way she'd stopped herself before saying more. She thought of the second set of initials on the support post upstairs, older and deeper than Harold's own. Outside, the mill wheel turned its slow half-circle in the current, groaning against its ruined axle, patient as it had been for 40 years. And Wren, closing the journal gently and retying its ribbon, understood that she was no longer just uncovering a fortune. She was uncovering a person nobody had let themselves fully remember. And whoever that woman had been, Della Voss was about to have to keep a promise she'd probably hoped she'd never need to. Della didn't answer the door right away when Wren knocked, and for a moment Wren thought she might not answer at all, that some doors, once you asked the question behind them, took longer to open than others. But she came, eventually, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and the look on her face when she saw the journal in Wren's hands told her everything before either of them said a word. "He wrote it down," Della said. "Not a question. He told me to ask you." Wren held up the journal like proof, like an invitation, about the woman, the second set of initials. Della stepped back from the door slowly, the old dog lifting its head from the rug and settling again when it saw who'd come. "Sit down then," she said. "This isn't a doorstep conversation." The kitchen smelled like wood smoke and yesterday's coffee, and Della moved around it with the particular carefulness of someone deciding, in real time, how much of a story she was finally willing to tell. She sat across from Wren, folded her hands on the table, and was quiet long enough that Wren almost prompted her before she started. "Her name was Ruth Ambrose, Harold's grandmother, your great-great-grandmother, if the lines still hold the way I think they do." Della's voice had gone lower, careful, like she was handling something breakable. "She built that wheelhouse room herself, before Harold's father was even born. Before women built much of anything, officially, in a town like this one, built it. Why? Because the mill wasn't hers either, not on paper, belonged to her husband's family, and by every account I ever heard, they didn't think much of her, thought she'd married up out of nothing, thought she didn't have the right to a say in how the place was run." Della's mouth tightened. "So she built herself a room nobody knew about, under the one part of the mill nobody else bothered to check, and little by little she put things in it, savings, land papers she bought under her own name when nobody else would let her hold property outright. A whole life she was building in secret, because the life she was allowed in the open wasn't enough to stand on." Wren thought of the chest, the deeds, the cash, bundled and waiting for decades in the dark. She was doing what I've been doing, building something nobody thought she had the right to build. That's exactly what she was doing. Della met her eyes, and when she died, everything in that room passed quiet, the way things did back then, to whichever son was willing to keep her secret, rather than argue with his father about it. That was Harold's father, and then it passed to Harold. "And Harold—" She stopped. "Harold never opened it either," Wren finished. "Not really. He looked at it, and knew, and couldn't make himself use it. Man carried guilt like other people carry keys, never went anywhere without it, and never quite worked out what door it opened." Della's voice caught, just slightly, a small crack in a woman who clearly didn't let herself crack often. "He used to say, the money would go to the person who understood it wasn't really about the money. Said he'd know her when he saw her. I don't think he ever really believed she'd come." Wren sat with that a long moment, the journal heavy in her lap, and felt something settle into place that she hadn't known was still unsettled, not just the mystery of the initials, but the shape of the whole inheritance itself. It had never been Harold's money to give, not really. It had been Ruth's, held in trust across 3 generations of men too afraid or too guilty to spend it, waiting for someone who'd understand what it had cost to save it in the first place. Why didn't he ever tell anyone? Fix her name back into the story properly. Because fixing it meant admitting what his own father did, writing a woman out of a life she built with her own hands, because the men around her couldn't stand to share credit with her. Della shook her head slowly. Some silences get so old, breaking them feels like the crime, instead of keeping them. Wren looked down at the journal, at Harold's uneven handwriting, at a man who'd spent decades protecting a secret he clearly understood was wrong to keep, and couldn't decide if she pitied him or resented him more. Maybe both. Maybe that was allowed. "I want to put her name back," Wren said, surprising herself with how certain it came out. "On the mill. On the deed, if I can. Somewhere people can actually see it." Something shifted in Della's face. Not quite a smile, but close to one. Ruth would have liked that, I think. Though she'd probably tell you the name matters less than what you build under it. They sat a while longer, the wood stove ticking, the dog sighing in its sleep, and Wren found herself asking the question that had been sitting under all the others since she'd first read Harold's handwriting. "Did you know him well? Before he died?" Della's answer came slower this time, and quieter. "Well enough to wish I'd pushed him harder to say all this himself. While he still could." She looked out the window, toward the mill's dark shape at the bottom of the hill. "Grief's a strange debt collector, honey. It comes due whether or not you're ready to pay it." Wren thought of her own dead. A mother she barely remembered, a string of caseworkers, and foster families who'd come and gone without ever quite becoming permanent, and understood, in a way she hadn't fully let herself before, that she wasn't the only person in this story carrying something unfinished. She drove back down to the mill as the light went gold and low across the water, the wheel turning its patient half-circle, and stood a long time in front of the support post with Harold's initials burned beside Ruth's older, deeper mark. 2 names, one who'd hidden and one who'd been hidden, and thought that whatever she built here now, it would have to be big enough to hold both of their stories at once. She didn't yet know how much the building itself would test her before she got the chance. The trouble started with a smell. Wren noticed it 3 days after her conversation with Della, a faint sweetness under the mineral cold of the mill, easy to miss until it wasn't. She traced it to the east wall, the one half swallowed in kudzu, and found the timber behind the vines, gone soft and dark, water damaged clean through in a way that hadn't shown from the outside. "That's not good," Hollis said, when she called him out to look at it. He pressed his thumb into the wood, and it gave like wet bread. "That's been rotting a long time. Vines probably hid it from everybody, including Harold." He looked up at the roofline, following some invisible calculation. Whole walls carrying more weight than it's got left to give. "How bad?" "Bad enough I wouldn't sleep another night in this building without shoring it first." They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, Hollis directing, Wren hauling and bracing, both of them racing a wall that seemed determined to finish falling before they finished fixing it. By dark, they'd gotten temporary supports in place. Enough, Hollis said, to buy a few days, not enough to call it solved. She should have listened harder to the not enough part. The storm came up fast 2 nights later, the kind of autumn system that arrives as rain and turns to something meaner within the hour. Wren woke to the sound of the creek, louder than she'd ever heard it, an angry rushing note under the drumming rain, and to a groan from the east wall unlike anything she'd heard the old wheel make. She got out of the sleeping bag and out of the building with maybe 90 seconds to spare. The wall didn't collapse all at once. It went in pieces. First a section of roofline, then the temporary bracing Hollis had rigged, then, with a sound like the whole building clearing its throat, a good third of the east wall folded inward into the ground floor, taking with it the shelving, a section of the old mill mechanism, and Wren's stomach dropped as she watched from the porch in the freezing rain, coming within a few feet of the wheelhouse stairs. A few feet from the room, a few feet from the chest, the journal, everything Ruth Ambrose had spent a lifetime hiding, and Harold had spent a lifetime protecting. She stood in the rain long after the worst of it had settled, soaked through, shaking with cold and something closer to grief, and thought, I almost lost it, all of it. The first real thing anyone ever gave me, and I almost lost it to a wall I knew was bad and didn't fix fast enough. Della found her there an hour later, having seen the collapse from her hillside window and driven down through the storm without being asked. She didn't say anything at first, just put a blanket around Wren's shoulders and steered her up to the truck. It was Hollis, arriving at first light, who said the thing Wren needed and didn't want to hear. You did what you could with what you had, he said, standing in the wreckage, surveying the damage with the flat, assessing look of a man who'd seen buildings fail before. This wall's been dying for 10 years. You've owned the place 6 weeks. Don't you dare stand here and tell yourself this is on you. It's my building. It's your building for 6 weeks. Harold let it rot for 10 years and called it waiting. That's not the same thing as failing, and you know it. He crouched, running a hand along a fallen beam, studying the wood the way he studied the door lock. Patient, unhurried, already 3 steps into a solution he hadn't said aloud yet. Question isn't whose fault this is. Question's whether you've still got the stomach to rebuild it properly instead of patching it like Harold did. It took Wren longer than she liked to answer, because the honest answer, in that moment, standing in the wet ruin of the one place that had ever been hers, was that she didn't know. The money in the chest would cover real repairs, proper ones, not stopgap bracing, but real repairs meant real commitment, meant staying in a town that had spent 6 weeks deciding whether to trust her, meant choosing this crooked, half-drowned building over every version of leaving that would have been easier. She thought of Ruth Ambrose building a secret room with her own hands, because no one would give her a place to stand in the open. She thought of Harold, decades of guilt sitting untouched in a chest, because he couldn't make himself finish what his grandmother started. 2 people who'd both, in their own ways, given up partway through. One because the world wouldn't let her finish, one because he was too afraid to try. I'll rebuild it, Wren said. Properly, not patched. Hollis nodded, like that was the only answer that would have satisfied him. Then we'd best start today. War like this doesn't wait twice. The insurance situation turned out to be exactly what Wren feared. Non-existent, given the property's condemned status, which meant every dollar of repair would come straight from the chest, straight from Ruth's decades of careful, hidden saving. It felt strange and right in equal measure, spending money a woman had hidden out of necessity on rebuilding, in the open, the very thing she'd never been allowed to claim credit for. Word of the collapse moved through Miller's Creek fast, the way bad news always did, and Wren braced herself for the town's verdict. Told you so, she expected, knew that place would finally fall down on somebody. Instead, over the following days, something she hadn't predicted began happening. The diner owner sent over hot meals without being asked. A retired contractor named Pruitt showed up with his own truck full of salvaged lumber and didn't leave a bill. Even Hollis, who'd made his skepticism plain from the first afternoon, started arriving before Wren woke up most mornings, like the collapse had settled some argument in his head about whether she was worth the trouble. Didn't expect this, she admitted to Della one evening, watching 3 separate trucks unload materials in the mill's muddy yard. Small towns don't always trust people right away, Della said, but they trust people who don't quit when the roof falls in. You've been tested now. Town's been waiting to see how you'd handle it. It wasn't the fortune in the chest that had changed how Miller's Creek saw her, Wren realized, watching Pruitt and Hollis argue amiably over beam placement in the grey morning light. It was the wall falling down, and her staying anyway. She still had a building half in ruins, money bleeding out faster than she'd planned, and a winter coming on that wouldn't wait for repairs to finish. But for the first time since the letter with the county seal had found her, she didn't feel like a stranger standing on borrowed ground. She felt, however precariously, like she was starting to belong somewhere. The rebuilding held together for almost 3 weeks before the next problem found her. Not the building this time, but her own body. She'd been favoring her left hand since the crowbar slipped and split her knuckles back in the wheelhouse, telling herself it was healing, telling herself the swelling was normal for someone doing this much manual labor with hands that had spent the last 4 years carrying diner trays instead of lumber. By the time Della noticed her wincing every time she gripped a hammer, the infection had already traveled halfway up her forearm, an angry red line under the skin that made even Hollis go quiet when he saw it. "That's blood poisoning starting, or close enough to it," Della said, already reaching for her truck keys. "You're not arguing with me about this." The ER was 40 minutes away, and Wren spent the whole drive in a strange, fevered half-focus, watching the fields blur past and thinking, absurdly, about the chest still sitting unguarded in the wheelhouse, about a wall only half rebuilt, about how close she'd come to losing everything to a rotted timber, and now might lose the ability to even swing a hammer because she'd been too stubborn to say "this hurts" out loud. The doctor who saw her didn't sugarcoat it. 2 more days untreated, she said, and they'd have been talking about something a great deal more serious than antibiotics, and a week of rest. As it was, a week of rest, minimum, hand elevated, no lifting, no gripping tools, an order Wren received with the same flat disbelief she'd once felt reading a letter about $8 in back taxes. "A week," she said to Della in the truck afterward, cradling her bandaged hand. "I don't have a week. Winter's coming. The wall's not finished. I don't have money to pay someone else to do what I should be doing myself." "You don't have a choice either," Della said, not unkindly. "Body doesn't negotiate the way you do." It was, Wren would think later, the lowest point since the storm. Lower, in some ways, because the storm had been a problem she could fix by working harder. And this was a problem that could only be solved by not working, by sitting still in Della's spare room with her hand throbbing under gauze, listening to hammering down the hill that she wasn't the one doing. She hated it. She hated it with a rawness that surprised her, because it wasn't really about the wall or the winter deadline. It was older than that, and she knew it even as she felt it. She had spent her whole life being the only person she could count on to finish anything, because every other person who'd promised to stay had eventually left, and now here she was, forced to sit useless while other people finished her work for her, and some old wordless part of her was certain that meant she'd failed, that needing help at all was proof she never should have tried. She said some version of that out loud on the 3rd day, staring at the ceiling of Della's spare room, half to Della and half to herself. "I feel like if I can't do it myself, it doesn't count, like it's not really mine if other people had to carry it." Della was quiet a long moment, mending something at the little sewing table by the window, not looking up right away. "You know Harold felt something like that too," she finally said. "Thought accepting help was the same as admitting he wasn't enough on his own. That's part of why that room sat locked 40 years. Man couldn't stand the thought that Ruth's saving might mean he hadn't built something entirely by himself." She set her mending down. "Didn't make him happier, holding it all alone, just made him lonelier. That's not the same as this, isn't it?" Della's eyes were steady, kind, unflinching. "Honey, that mill's been standing on help since before you were born. Ruth built that room because nobody would let her build in the open. Harold kept the wheel running 40 years past since because folks in this town kept quietly fixing what he couldn't. You've had Hollis in your yard before dawn most mornings for weeks now, and Pruitt hauling free lumber, and me driving you to an emergency room at 11 at night. None of that makes what you're building less yours. It makes it the kind of thing that actually lasts. Wren didn't have an answer for that right away. She lay there listening to the faint, distant sound of hammering down the hill. Hollis and Pruitt, working without her, on her wall, in her building, because they'd decided somewhere along the way that it mattered enough to show up for even when she couldn't ask. On the 5th day, restless and unable to stand the ceiling any longer, she made Della drive her down to the mill, hand still wrapped, under strict instructions to touch nothing. She stood in the yard and watched Hollis fitting new timber into the wall's frame, precise and unhurried, watched Pruitt whistling tunelessly while he sorted salvage lumber by grain, watched the wheel turn its slow half-circle behind them all, patient as it had been through every version of this building's long, quiet history of people needing each other more than they wanted to admit. "You're supposed to be resting," Hollis said, without looking up. "I am resting. I'm just resting here instead of up the hill." He almost smiled at that, the closest she'd seen yet, and went back to his measuring. She sat on the porch steps most of that day, hand elevated, doing nothing but watching, and found, to her own surprise, that it didn't feel like failure the way she'd expected. It felt like something closer to what Della had described, a building held up by more hands than just her own, and no less hers for it. By the time her stitches came out and the doctor cleared her for light work, the east wall stood fully framed, weather-tight, waiting only for her hands to finish what other hands had carried her through. She ran her good hand along the new timber, solid where the old wood had been soft, and thought of Ruth Ambrose's hidden savings, of Harold's 40 years of silent guilt, of a whole family line that had confused asking for help with losing what was theirs. She wasn't going to make that mistake. Not with the mill, and, she suspected, watching Della's truck pull away up the hill, watching Hollis pack his tools with the unhurried care of a man who'd quietly decided to keep showing up, not with anything else that mattered from here on out either. With her hand healed enough for light work, Wren went looking through the wheelhouse room properly for the first time, not for the money, this time, but for whatever else Ruth Ambrose had left behind that she hadn't yet had the strength to face. She found it in a false bottom of the same waxed folder that held the deeds, a second, smaller ledger, its pages brittle and foxed with age, filled with tight, careful handwriting that wasn't Harold's. Ruth's, she realized within a few lines, dates going back to the 1930s, a long column of names down the left margin, and beside each one, small sums of money and short notations. Paid the Hendersons' grocer bill, February. Covered Tom Ashworth's seed corn after the frost took his crop. Quiet loan to the widow Pruitt, repaid in full, God bless her stubborn pride. Wren sat very still, reading name after name, recognizing more than a few of them. Pruitt, the retired contractor who'd hauled free lumber for weeks without asking for a dime. Ashworth, whose granddaughter ran the diner that had been sending over hot meals since the storm. Ruth Ambrose hadn't just hidden money away for some distant future heir. She'd spent decades quietly propping up half the town from a room nobody knew existed, giving away in secret what she'd never been allowed to claim credit for in the open. The money in the chest wasn't a nest egg Ruth had been hoarding for herself. It was what was left over after a lifetime of giving most of it away. Wren carried the ledger up to Della's kitchen that evening, hands not quite steady, and set it on the table between them. She was doing what this whole town's been doing for me, Wren said. Feeding people, covering what they couldn't cover themselves, and nobody ever knew it was her. Della read a few pages in silence, her jaw tightening in a way Wren hadn't seen before. Not surprise exactly, but something closer to grief arriving late. My own grandmother's name is in here, she said quietly, finding it near the bottom of one page. Widow Pruitt. I always wondered how she kept that farm through the worst of the Depression, with 5 children and no husband left standing. She closed the ledger gently, like it might bruise. Family legend always credited a bank loan, Nobody ever said the bank was a woman in a locked room nobody was allowed to acknowledge. It reframed everything, sitting there in Della's kitchen with the wood stove ticking. Harold hadn't just been protecting a hidden fortune out of guilt. He'd been sitting, paralyzed, on top of a debt the whole town owed, and didn't know it owed. Too afraid, maybe, that opening the room properly would mean admitting how much of Miller's Creek had survived on the quiet generosity of a woman his own family had refused to credit. "I know what I want to do," Wren said, and found, once she'd said it aloud, that she meant it completely. "I want to finish the mill, not just live in it, run it. A working mill again, or close to it, something the town can actually use. And I want Ruth Ambrose's name on it, not Harold's. Not mine, hers, first and largest." Della's eyes were wet, though she didn't quite let the tears fall. She'd have liked that more than she'd have known what to do with, I expect. It should have felt like the end of the hardest part. The mystery solved, the money found, the plan set. But 3 nights later, with the first hard freeze of the season locking the creek at its edges, Wren woke to the smell of smoke. Not the mineral, cellar-cold smell of the wheelhouse. Wood smoke, sharp and close, coming from the temporary stovepipe she and Hollis had installed to get her through the winter, while the rest of the building's heating system waited on repair funds. She'd learned to run that stove herself over the past 2 weeks. Bank the coals right, check the flue, never load it too full before sleep. Lessons Hollis had drilled into her with the same patient insistence he'd brought to the lock and the wall. Because a mill this old, he'd told her more than once, doesn't forgive carelessness with fire. She came awake fast, the way you come awake when your body already knows something is wrong before your mind catches up, and found a thin curl of smoke seeping from around the stovepipe's joint where it passed through the newly framed section of the east wall, the same wall that had collapsed weeks before, timber still curing, still more vulnerable than anything else in the building. Her hands moved before her fear did. She remembered exactly what Hollis had taught her. Cut the draft first, don't feed it air. She slammed the stove's intake shut, grabbed the fire extinguisher Pruitt had insisted on leaving behind, just in case, better safe, and had the smoldering seam in the new framing doused before the smoke had thickened past a haze. It was over in under 2 minutes. It felt, standing there afterward in the freezing dark, with her heart slamming and her hands finally starting to shake, like it had lasted an hour. She sat on the cold floor a long while, staring at the scorched but unburned timber, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, how close this had come to undoing everything. The wall Hollis had rebuilt, the room Ruth had hidden, the whole fragile, hard-won foundation of the life she was only just starting to trust as hers. If she hadn't learned the stove properly, if she hadn't known, instinctively, to cut the air before running for water, if she'd still been the girl who didn't know this building's dangers as well as its promises, she hadn't needed rescuing. That was the thought that stayed with her longest, sitting there in the cold with her pulse finally slowing. 6 weeks ago she'd have panicked, or worse, not known what to do at all. Tonight, the skills she'd earned, patiently, stubbornly, with Hollis standing over her shoulder more mornings than she could count, had been enough. She thought of Ruth, alone in a locked room building a future no one would credit her for. She thought of Harold, 40 years too afraid to finish what his grandmother started. She wasn't going to be the 3rd generation who let fear win the argument. By the time the first real snow came to Miller's Creek, the mill wheel had a new axle, the east wall stood weather-tight and whole, and a hand-lettered sign hung from the porch rail that Wren had painted herself, 3 coats, until the letters came out steady. Ambrose Mill, not Whitfield, not Calloway. Ambrose, Ruth's name, first and largest, exactly as Wren had promised in Della's kitchen weeks before. The reopening wasn't anything grand. She hadn't planned a ceremony, hadn't expected more than Della and Hollis, and maybe Pruitt, showing up to see the new sign go up. Instead, half the town seemed to find a reason to walk down to the creek that Saturday morning. The diner owner with a box of pastries nobody had asked her to bring, the county clerk who'd first called about the $8 in back taxes, even a few faces Wren didn't recognize, people who'd apparently just wanted to see, with their own eyes, the building everyone had spent months talking about. Hollis stood near the porch with his arms crossed, watching the crowd with the particular satisfaction of a man who'd bet correctly on something and wasn't going to say so out loud. When Wren caught his eye, he only nodded once, which she'd learned by now was the closest thing to a speech he'd ever give her. "You did good by this place," Della said quietly, standing beside her as the crowd milled through the newly repaired ground floor, admiring the restored mechanism Wren and Hollis had spent 3 weeks getting to turn again, however slowly, however symbolically. "Better than good. You did right by her." "I had a lot of help doing it. That's the part Ruth would have loved most, I think." Della's eyes were soft. She spent her whole life giving help nobody let her admit to giving. Bet it would have meant something, seeing a place built on help nobody's ashamed of anymore. It hadn't been a simple few months, getting here. The money from the chest, Ruth's money, quietly saved and quietly given away for decades before it ever reached Wren, had covered most of the structural repairs, the new wiring, the wheel mechanism itself, restored not for grinding grain commercially anymore, but as a working exhibit, a small operating watermill that could still turn, still grind a modest batch of cornmeal on weekends, still show a town's children what the building their great-great-grandparents had depended on used to look like in motion. The rest of the ground floor Wren had turned into something new, a small shop selling that cornmeal alongside local honey and preserves, a single long table where, on Saturdays, anyone in town was welcome to sit and eat, no charge, no explanation required, a tradition she'd started almost without meaning to, the first week after the fire scare, when Della and Hollis and Pruitt had simply kept showing up with food and company until it became a fixture nobody wanted to end. She'd found herself, without entirely planning it, building the very thing Ruth's hidden ledger had described, a quiet, steady source of help for whoever in town needed it, except now it didn't have to hide in a locked room underground. It could sit right out in the open, in daylight, with her own name on the door, not as an owner exactly, but as a keeper of something bigger than herself. The mining claim papers from the chest, it turned out, held one more surprise. A small but real royalty interest on land 2 counties over. Nothing dramatic, but enough, combined with careful management of what remained of Ruth's savings, to mean Wren would never again know the particular fear of $11 in a jacket pocket and nowhere left to turn. She was careful with it, the way she'd always been careful. But for the first time in her life, careful didn't feel the same as frightened. Near the end of that Saturday, as the crowd began to thin and the light went long and gold across the water, a woman Wren didn't recognize approached the porch, hanging back at the edge of the yard, the way people do when they're not sure they have the right to interrupt. 19, maybe 20, worn coat, a duffel bag she hadn't set down even standing still. "Are you Wren Calloway?" the girl asked. "The county clerk said, she said you'd know what it's like. Aging out, having nowhere." She swallowed hard, the way you swallow when you've rehearsed a sentence and still can't quite get through it steady. "I don't have anywhere to go after this month. I don't know why I'm telling you that. I just heard about this place, and I thought, I don't know what I thought." Wren looked at her for a long moment, seeing something she recognized so completely it ached. The guarded shoulders, the too tight grip on the one bag that held everything, the specific, exhausted bravery of a person who'd learned young that no one was coming to save them. "I know exactly what you thought," Wren said. "Come, sit down. There's a table inside with room at it, and nobody here's going to ask you to explain yourself before you're ready." The girl's eyes filled, quick and startled, like she hadn't expected kindness to be offered without a catch attached. She followed Wren inside anyway, watching her settle at the long table, accepting a plate from Della without quite meeting anyone's eyes. Wren understood, with a clarity that settled deep and certain in her chest, exactly what Harold's letter had meant when he wrote that the money was never really the inheritance. Ruth had given quietly, in secret, because the world of her time wouldn't let her give any other way. Harold had held it all, frozen, because guilt had made him too afraid to finish what she started. And now here Wren was, free of that fear, free of that secrecy, passing it forward in the open, to a girl who needed exactly what she herself had once needed most, not charity, but a place to stand. Outside, the wheel turned its slow, steady circle in the last of the daylight, no longer groaning, no longer patient in the tired way it had been for 40 years. Just turning, the way it was always meant to. A year is a strange unit to measure a life by, Wren would think later, long enough to change everything, short enough that she could still remember, with total clarity, the exact weight of $11 in a jacket pocket and a duffel bag that held the whole of what she owned. The girl from the porch, her name was Callie, it turned out, and she'd stayed the first week only meaning to stay one night, was still at the mill that following autumn, sleeping in the small room off the old grain store that Wren had fixed up, without quite admitting to herself, at first, that she was building it for someone else's arrival. Callie had a gift for the books that Wren didn't, kept the shop's accounts straighter than Wren ever had, and had slowly, over the months, stopped flinching every time someone offered her something without asking anything back. Wren recognized the exact shape of that unlearning, because she'd done it herself, slower, alone, until Della and Hollis had shown her it didn't have to be. The mill itself had settled into its new rhythm the way old buildings do when they're finally being used the way they were meant to be. The wheel turning Saturday mornings for the children who came to watch cornmeal grind the old way. The long table filling most weekends with whoever in town needed a hot meal and easy company more than they needed to explain why. Hollis had taken to showing up most days whether there was work or not, tinkering with the mechanism, teaching Callie and, sometimes, other young people who drifted through, the particular patience of fixing something with your hands instead of giving up on it. Della's dog had died that spring, peacefully, by the wood stove, and Della had cried harder than Wren expected, and then, a week later, shown up at the mill with a new dog anyway, because, she said, some things you rebuild simply because the alternative is worse. Wren had kept Ruth's ledger in a glass case near the shop entrance, alongside a short, plainly worded card, explaining who Ruth Ambrose had been and what she'd quietly done for this town across 4 decades. Nobody had properly credited her for. People read it more than she expected. Some of them, she noticed, stood in front of it a long time, the way you stand in front of something that rearranges what you thought you knew about your own family, your own town, your own history of who had actually been holding things together all along. She still had Harold's journal too, though she'd stopped rereading it as often, not because it mattered less, but because she'd finally stopped needing it to tell her what to do next. She knew what to do next. She'd known for a while now. On the 1-year anniversary of the day she'd first knelt in 3 inches of cold water, prying at an iron door, Wren stood on the porch of Ambrose Mill in the low gold light of late afternoon, and thought about how much of her life had been shaped by things she never asked for. A mother who died too young, a system that ran out of places to put her, a great-uncle she'd never met who'd carried a guilt for 40 years he never found the courage to resolve himself. She thought, too, about the things nobody could have handed her, no matter how much money had been sitting in that chest. The patience Hollis had taught her, one stubborn lock and one rebuilt wall at a time. The steadiness Della had offered without ever making her feel like a burden for needing it. The particular, hard-won understanding that asking for help wasn't the failure she'd spent her whole life afraid it was. It was, more often, The only way anything worth keeping ever actually got built. If there was a lesson in all of it, and she'd come, slowly, to believe there was, it wasn't really about the money, or even about the mill itself. It was about what happens when you stop mistaking silence for strength. Ruth had hidden her generosity because her world gave her no other choice. Harold had hidden his guilt because he mistook admitting it for weakness. Wren had spent years hiding her own need behind a wall of self-reliance so old she'd forgotten it was a wall at all. It had taken a condemned building, a locked door, and a whole town's worth of quiet, patient kindness to teach her that the strongest thing she'd ever done wasn't surviving alone. It was letting people in. She thought about that a long moment, watching the wheel turn its steady circle in the low autumn light, watching smoke curl gently from the chimney where Callie was likely putting the kettle on, watching a town that had once looked at her with polite suspicion now walk down the hill on a Saturday simply because there was a place there that felt like it belonged to all of them. If you've ever felt like you were starting completely over with next to nothing, like the whole world had decided you weren't worth investing in, I hope some part of Wren's story found you exactly where you needed it. Because the truth is, the thing that changes everything is rarely the money. It's the moment you let someone hand you a tool, or a meal, or a little patience, and you let yourself believe you might actually deserve it. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear which part stayed with you longest. Leave it in the comments below. And if you want more stories like Wren's, make sure you're subscribed, because there are so many more waiting to be told. Ruth Ambrose spent a lifetime giving in secret, because the world wouldn't let her give in the open. 100 years later, her name is painted on a sign by a creek, in daylight, for good. Some inheritances take longer than a lifetime to finally come due.